Hello and welcome back to Management 101. I am your host, Max Weniker. Today I am joined by a friend and former colleague, Chrissy Donnelly, who has a very informed perspective on some of the topics we discuss on this show, in particular around founders and founders as leaders. So I asked Chrissy to join me today to help me talk through this topic of what makes a good founder. The reason I think it's useful to talk about this is because a lot of people, most founders are first-time founders. They are someone who's come up with an idea, wants to create a business out of it. And there is a wide range of good and bad founders. Hopefully, if we do our jobs today and a potential founder or a current founder listens to this episode, there will be some things that they don't realize that they're doing or not doing that they could change to become a better founder and leader and be more likely to be successful. And there are maybe some things that they don't realize they are doing that are good and that they could further accentuate. All that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Chrissy. Chrissy, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining. Couple questions for you. One, where are you based? And two, tell us a little bit. I guess this isn't a question. This is a statement or a request. Tell us a little bit about your background, where we work together, what you do now, any other big highlights of the career. You bring an interesting and perhaps more useful perspective in many ways, because not only are you observing founders from the perspective of, I am working for these companies, and you've worked for a number of small startups turned big ones. Rappi and Uber are two of the, I think, darlings of the Latin America tech space in many ways. You've also worked with some smaller ones that continue to be small, and you work very closely with those founders. But you've also put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and literally are taking the information you've gotten from your career around what makes a good or a bad founder and deciding how to invest the money accordingly. So hopefully for you tens of listeners out there, this is an even more informed perspective than we normally get, because this is from an investment perspective as well. And one thing I'll also note that you do in your consulting work, which I think is quite relevant to the discussion, is you spend a lot of time helping founders build pitch decks and figure out how to raise money. You're very familiar with the VC space. So your perspective also, I think, is informed by what makes a good founder in the sense of a founder who can raise money. Sure. Yeah. And we actually, in the show notes, we went back and forth a little bit on Define good, because yes, good could mean many things in the context of what makes a good founder. We'll get into that. All right. Let's start off with common themes among the best founders you worked with. And this is the start of the back and forth of what does best mean? And I think ultimately the way I define best here is most successful. And I think success is, did someone build a single or series of companies that were sustainably profitable? Is this company still a going concern and has a lot of value and is hopefully sustainably profitable? That's an interesting point. Maybe I'll split this into a couple of parts, because I think that there are multiple versions of successful companies. There are the scaled unicorns, the Ubers of the world. Certainly the founders of those large unicorns have been successful in some way. I also think that a startup that turns into a quote unquote lifestyle business, one that maybe didn't become a unicorn, but is throwing off cash and is rewarding investors, shareholders, and employees, that's certainly a win too. Also think a successful founder could be someone who built a company to a certain point and then recognized, I am now at the point where I am no longer the right fit for the next stage of growth, and is self-aware enough to say, in order to take this company to the next level, it has to be someone else doing this thing. A successful founder doesn't have to be someone who brought it from zero all the way to the end. It could just be a founder who brought it to whatever point was within their wheelhouse, did it well, and set it up to be taken to the next level by whoever that next more professional CEO might be. Exactly. Maybe that's one of the things we'll get into in the not successful piece of this, but it's certainly, it's not all that uncommon for a founder to hold on too long and lack the self-awareness to say, okay, this is probably not where I'm going to be most successful. Let's talk through 2 to 3 things that you think are common themes amongst the founders you worked with that you thought were the best. Love that. Is it possible for a founder to be lazy and figure out the most direct or shortcut ways of getting things done? Strategic laziness, in the sense that I am figuring out how I can no longer do this thing. I agree with you. I think that there are certainly, a founder needs energy and hustle, the desire or motivation to constantly keep going, because a startup is not a staid entity. It's constantly evolving. There's new information coming from the marketplace. There's new information coming from customers. There's all kinds of new priorities that may arise as the company's strategy changes. There's all kinds of challenges that are constantly coming up that the ones 6 months from now might be completely different from the ones today. And it might be really hard to prepare for the ones 6 months from now. You really need to focus on the ones today to even get to that point 6 months from now. Definitely founders need energy. I do think, and you alluded to this a little bit, there are two versions of energy. There's the, I'm just going to push. And then there's the strategic version of that. I imagine you have also seen founders and managers more generally who don't figure out how to scale themselves. And while they work really hard, they've also, as the company has grown, become the bottleneck to anything else getting done without them. Interesting. That is well put and something I wish more founders heeded. All right. Next thing. What's another top thing that is a common theme amongst best founders you've worked with? Interesting. I've thought about this a lot because I think I agree with you, but I also want to believe that there are exceptions too. I think about it from my own life. And if I were to be a founder of a more than one person consulting firm, what would that company do? And I look back at my career, the things that I most enjoyed or the things that would really make me run through walls. And there's a common theme amongst types of problems that I'm more interested in. For instance, if I were to ever have the opportunity to work at an airline, and to be clear, world, this is not a sales pitch. Uh, there are unfortunately, no airlines based in San Diego, California. But if I were to ever work for an airline, I could imagine pretty much any job there being something that I'd want to run through a wall for. I just find the space and the set of problems so fascinating. Whereas if you had me working for a clubbing baby seals company, I would probably be really unexcited about every single thing that I had to do there. But I think that there's a middle ground. So I will say that despite spending the longest part of my career at Uber, I don't think I'm personally particularly passionate about ride sharing. To be fair, I'm not Travis Kalanick. I'm not the founder of Uber. But I think what motivated me was the environment in which I got to solve problems. It was very white space. It wasn't just fix this specific problem and then fix this next specific problem. It was like, we don't know exactly what problems exist, and it's part of your job to figure them out and then go solve them. And part of it was the people I got to do it with, right? I've worked at some companies where the quality of my coworkers, of my management was relatively low. Whereas at Uber, I feel like I was surrounded by smart people who really could help me solve problems and who I enjoyed learning from. And it was those two things together that made it an environment where I would run through walls. Is it possible for that to be true for a founder? Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Maybe there's a middle ground here, which is ultimately the founder hires a bunch of really great people, but all of whom are doing entirely different things from each other in not a concerted, organized effort. It doesn't really matter if they're doing great work. That work won't build on itself and the company won't move forward. If it's not passionate about a specific problem that is the rallying cry for everyone, the founder needs to at least be good at focusing everyone on the right strategic problems to be solved, because it's not just a question of hiring the right people and enabling them. It's also pointing them in the right direction. And I think typically, particularly in an early stage startup, the mission is that it is the single problem that everyone wants to solve. When you think back to the early days of Uber, for example, it was just, we need to democratize transportation and create income opportunities for transportation workers. That just lent itself to, let's try to get cars on the road. That wasn't hard as a rallying cry, but you could easily see a world where people are working on something that maybe doesn't create the same level of passion. We're making some widget to make hospitals slightly more organized. I don't know. Something that maybe doesn't tie directly back to, oh, this is creating some public good, something that's harder to rally around. So long as the founder is saying, here is the single problem or set of problems we want to be solving right now, you could probably create some similar sense of mission, so to speak. True. Yeah. One of the things I think is interesting about the concept of mission, I'm curious if you've experienced this too. I have seen a pretty consistent theme in startups as they've grown, and particularly as they've raised more money, where they go from very mission driven to losing that theme as they grow. I think when money is raised, particularly from VC or venture capital, there becomes a second set of incentives, so to speak, around growth and profitability and pretty lofty targets that need to be hit. And sometimes that means companies will cut corners on the mission. And over time, that thread of the mission is lost. Is that something you have seen as well? And then second of all, how do you solve for that as a founder? Is it focusing on strategic priorities and rallying people around those instead of problem? Is it getting the company back to the problem? I'm curious. Or how do you replace mission driven and keep people focused? Definitely. Yep. Something you and I worked on together was the 2018 Latin America ride strategy. And this was in mid or late 2017. I don't remember all of the details at this point because it's been 6 years, but I can vividly remember a triangle of priorities that was something like quality, safety, and trust, something like that. Right. And particularly quality was the area that I was most focused on in driver operations. And the fact that I remember that 6 years on because the organization's leaders had really boiled down our focus to those three things and nothing else, I think speaks volumes about how impactful a good strategy can be, particularly when it says not just here's what we're focused on and why, but also more importantly for almost every startup, here's what we're not going to be doing. To me, that's the number one failure of most startup leaders as the company grows is they think I have more people, I can take on more priorities. And if anything, the answer is the opposite, which is the more people, the more diffusion the message is going to have. And therefore, the tighter it needs to be. It's really easy for you and 5 other employees to just have everything in your brains be the same about what needs to get done and why. It's a lot harder for you and 500 people to have everything in your brains be the same. And therefore, you really need to distill that message and be very deliberate and judicious around what your priorities are. They aren't. Yes, that's not a thing. Right. Also, the worst that happens is they get tired of you saying it, and that means it's in their brain to the point that they don't need to hear it again. That's a great problem. Exactly. Let's go to the opposite question now. I feel like this is a great deep dive. first of all. So thank you for the thoughts. Just as a brief recap, maybe before we get to the next thing. Top 2 to 3 things Chrissy thinks are the most common themes amongst best founders she has worked with: energy, surrounding themselves with great people, and caring about the problem. Let's go to the opposite. Common themes amongst the worst founders you've worked with. And obviously you should name them all by name. I'm just kidding. One of my clients had a founder who's exactly like you're describing, was really focused on publicity and raising a unicorn round, and did those things. To the naked eye, this company seemed quite successful. But then once I got into the weeds a little bit, I realized all of this was at the expense of doing things in the right way, of building proper infrastructure, of hiring really good people versus people who were just attracted to all the publicity and potential valuation. It was at the expense of a long-term strategy because the only focus was on growing enough to raise that round. It was, I'm sure this is really common. I wish that I could send almost every founder to therapy to unpack what it is that makes them need to raise money at $1 billion valuation. But my next client after that was a company where the founder heard me talk about, not obviously the name of this previous company, but one of my previous clients. And I was describing this phenomenon of, I think even I was a little bit starstruck by how well publicized and well branded this company was, only to discover that it was a wolf in sheep's clothing. No, that's too aggressive a metaphor. Something not as great surrounded by something that looks good. That the Prometheus, Epimetheus mythology story. I don't remember the details, but something like it was dressed up nicely and underneath was something not so great. Yeah, exactly right. And I talked this, right. Or if anything, it was dressed up to cover what was truly something not impressive. I was talking to this next founder who said, I've seen a lot of companies like that. And they said, I have focused my company on not raising money at all unless we have to. We avoid the press because it doesn't really do anything for us. And my focus is on building the company, not on getting the name out there. I would happily have a unicorn company that no one had ever heard of, because every single effort I make towards getting publicity and raising money from big name investors is taking away from building. And I hadn't really thought about it exactly in those terms. I had just come away from this previous experience thinking this wasn't what I expected it to be. But when this founder put it like that, I thought that was really well said, of actually having the proper motivation and focusing externally can really come at the expense of doing things correctly internally and building a real company. That's fair. That's true. I wonder if some of it is how much of this is the company getting publicity versus how much of it is the founder getting publicity? Because I think those are very different things. There was definitely a point in Uber's journey where the story became a lot more about the now ex-CEO than it did about the company, right? Uber was becoming infamous for that rather than that being a PR strategy. And I don't think the then CEO would have said, oh, I wanted this, but I think that there were some common themes in behaviors that were really, if anything, meant to almost taunt public regulators and other entities rather than let's figure out how to make the story not about us. Reputational data. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so improper motivation. Couldn't agree more. What's the next one? It's almost over delegation in some ways. Yeah. Yes, shiny object syndrome. I do think it is related somewhat to improper motivation, but it's more distraction than purposeful. Improper motivation is I purposely want these things that are not aligned with what's needed for the business to be successful. Whereas shiny object syndrome is just I get easily distracted, right? It's a little bit less intentional, but is equally, I think, problematic. I have definitely had managers and founders I've worked with who were constantly thinking about something different than what we discussed the previous day. And that I would often think, why does this matter at all? It's pretty easy to see when a leader or a founder is getting distracted by something that probably isn't all that relevant in the grand scheme of things. And it's pretty common, I think, for that to happen. Yeah. So I have a couple thoughts on this. One is founders typically are the people that are the least managed in a company, right? I, as a founder, am not having a weekly one-on-one with my board members to get feedback and to discuss priorities. So there are a lot fewer checks and balances than find some mid-level manager at a company like Uber or even a 100-person startup. I have someone above me who's saying, you're getting distracted. Whereas a founder doesn't necessarily have that except once every quarter in the board meeting. And that's only if a board is really attuned to what is happening in the company, which is incredibly unlikely for the most part. And so I think one is there's just no rails. I think the other is who self-selects into the founder bucket versus the average human being. I think tends to be someone who likes to jump around and focus on a bunch of different things. They're literally opting into a job that requires you to do a ton of different stuff. And it's a kind of unique skill set to both be able to focus on a ton of different things, all of which have totally different contexts. If I'm putting on my marketing hat in the morning and putting on my ops hat in the afternoon and my sales hat the next morning, those are totally unrelated things in many ways. It seems like a not that far leap to then have that person also be easily distracted. Yes, that is true. It's essentially a manager. You're right. The problem is it goes back to the self-selecting pool. Those who choose to engage executive coach often are those who are the most willing to adjust and to be told they're doing things wrong. And there's a population of founders who genuinely believe they know better than others. I would be willing to bet a lot of money on the percent of founders who have narcissistic tendencies versus the percent of the average population that has narcissistic tendencies is much higher. And I think something that comes from that is a belief that I know better than other people. I think this is like a pretty classic saying in behavioral therapy of you can only really help someone if they want to change. And I think that's true of a certain bucket of founders as well, who maybe even will engage an executive coach because their board has asked them to, or any other number of reasons besides, I really want to hear what I'm doing. Many will engage an executive coach and simply not listen. Many also will simply not engage an executive coach at all because they don't want those checks and balances. I actually am going to expand on this point a little bit in the disconnect from the business that we originally talked about, because I think it's along the same lines. One of the red flags for me around a founder is how much control they attempt to retain as the company grows, and in particular, a board setup. I've seen multiple versions of boards. I've seen the rubber stamp boards that don't have majority voting power, where the CEO or founder retains basically majority control on their own and has installed figureheads rather than actual helpful board members. And then I've seen boards that engage in constructive dialogue and at times tension with the executive team. To me, now having watched this play out on both sides repeatedly, I think I would always opt to work with a founder who creates checks and balances over one who attempts to retain total control. I think the reasons that they attempt to retain total control to them are, I know my business better than anyone else does, and I can't predict what a set of board members will do. I need the ability to run my business. But I think what inevitably happens almost every time is, like a dictator, the motivations change, or simply that founder is trying to retain control such that no one can check them. And even if board members might make bad decisions sometimes, they're also a kind of necessary piece of the checks and balance system in a company. And I think I would pretty aggressively avoid working with a founder who has created a kangaroo court of a board. Yeah. Oh, cool. I also think that outcomes do not reflect quality of process. In a normal distribution curve, there will be extreme outcomes on either end. If you played out that Facebook scenario 1,000 times, it wouldn't end up with remarkable growth story and success over time every single time. Bad decisions can lead to good outcomes sometimes, just like good decisions can lead to bad outcomes sometimes. I think it's a question around the process. And for every Facebook where the founder retained majority control, there are many other not so success stories where that didn't play out that way. And I think generally that to me means that when you look at that same process reflected over many outcomes, if the consistent outcome is not a good one, that probably means the process is not the right one. Exactly. That's really interesting. It's a tough set of personality traits to have. In one sense, I was talking about this with a friend the other day who had a successful exit from their startup and was starting another company. And they said, being a founder requires some level of irrationality. You have to believe that despite overwhelming odds that your company is going to fail because the percent of startups that have a meaningful exit is very small, well below 10%, and maybe even well below 1% for all I know, but you have to be irrational. But at the same time, while you have to be irrational and really believe that you know something that other people don't, or think something that other people don't, you have to also create this set of checks and balances to say, well, I need to safeguard against my own worst tendencies where I think differently than other people. It's a very hard balance to strike. And I don't think I could think of a founder off the top of my head that perfectly strikes that balance. I think it's just being in somewhat of a range and maybe not being on the extreme ends in either direction is maybe the goal. Right. Right. And who sets up their job to potentially get themselves fired at some point. That's a rare trait. I think that requires a level of confidence that maybe doesn't exist consistently. I can readily recognize that confidence or lack thereof in myself. There were times earlier in my career where I felt pretty far out of my element or where I didn't feel like I was in a quote unquote safe environment career wise, where my natural tendency was to try to harness power. And not because I was ill intentioned, but rather just because I thought that the more I retained some control over things, the less replaceable I was. Particularly, I remember my early days at Uber. I was just really young. I was in my early 20s, barely out of college. I didn't know any better. I didn't know that careers were long and that you didn't need to make perfect steps at every rung of the ladder and all that. I set up a lot of my team to not allow it to function without me, to the point that my manager came to me and was like, you need to figure out how to hand some stuff off. Like, you can't be the single point of failure. Later on in my career, as I got more confident and realized, oh, it's just a job. If I don't have this job, I'll get another one. Or the strength of the relationships I build is a lot more important than the specific outcome I've created in this one role in this one quarter. Then I really focused on, okay, how do I replace myself? Because the only way to move up, to take on more responsibility, to learn, to try out other things would be to have my own stuff boxed up enough that I wasn't necessary for it. That was only later on in my Uber journey. And I think of myself, and maybe this is tooting my own horn a little bit, but I think of myself as a very reflective person and someone who's often trying to think about the why behind things and what's the most considerate approach given all the options, and try to take a step back a little bit. If there's a founder who isn't doing that work, which is, I think it's uncommon for people to be super self-reflective. It's a hard exercise and one that requires certain brain pathways that maybe not everyone has. It would be very easy to see why a founder would retain that more early career Max mindset of, I need to just harness power because I don't have the confidence that I will land on my feet or the right things will happen if I don't have full control myself. Right. It's also tough when you tie it to your own identity, right? This company did well or poorly, and that is a direct reflection on me. Whereas in reality, you could do all the right things and sometimes it won't work out. And that's not a reflection on you. So I think the more that a founder ties the success or lack thereof of their company to themselves, the less likely they are to be able to make really well thought out decisions. And the more personally they're going to take problems, which is never a good thing. We've talked about some of these things already, but I'm going to move on to the next topic and we can bounce around it. Stack ranking traits that an ideal founder should have. So you've actually mentioned a couple of these already, but I'm going to list them out, and I want you to pick out just one that really stands out to you that we haven't talked about already, as I would happily I would pick this every time in a founder. And then I also maybe would ask that you take from this list one where you're like, it's okay if a founder doesn't have this, and I would never prioritize it. So here's the list, and there's 10 of them or so. Ability to hire, ability to raise money, ability to set a vision and guide the company to achieve it, ability to operationalize / make stuff happen, ability to manage a team, ethical management of the business, ability to adjust, strategic thinking, and boundless drive and energy. Now, you already mentioned the energy one, and you said surrounding yourself with great people. So that's a little bit different than managing a team. Any of these stick out to you as, I need this in every founder? If I'm going to angel invest in a founder, they need to have this one. That's table stakes. Yeah. You want to sleep at night? That's fair. What's interesting is that I think that one is not necessarily correlated with company success, maybe the least correlated with company success of any of these. Not to say that unethical founders are more likely to be successful, but rather just ethically managing a business does not necessarily mean you're going to have a successful one. It just means you can sleep at night. However, I completely agree with you. I do think that the bad guys win sometimes, and that's just an unfortunate outcome of life. However, I also want to sleep at night. I also want to feel good about the work that I do, and I want to feel good about where I put my money, and I want to feel good about the people I work with. So despite ethical management of the business not being something that necessarily directly correlates with success, the same way that the ability to manage a team might, I also agree it is table stakes. Let's take away this one. Fair enough. Yes, you're referring to the Sam Bankman-Fried type situation. The lack of it results in a higher likelihood of failure. That's fair. Yes. I like that. Next one. We are assuming that every company we work with has a founder who ethically manages the business. Now, what do you want from that founder? Find me a founder who has all of them. I will give them all of my money. That's true. Yeah, sure. Could not agree with this more. To me, I think ideas are a dime a dozen. I think founders have a lot of ideas. I have always enjoyed, and this is literally what I built my business on, the concept that other people are going to have great ideas. There's lots of people with ideas. There's very few people can execute on them. And I always say in my sales pitch, I don't have good ideas. You have the ideas. I just help you make them reality. Because I think that there are a lot fewer people who execute effectively. And I really enjoy playing in that space. And I completely agree with you. There is a double-edged sword here. And I think it's that the ability to operationalize is not, I know exactly what to do and will tell people to do it. And the episode that I haven't published yet, but will be out by the time people hear this one, talks about one of the major failures of managers is telling people how rather than what. You as a manager, it's your job to say, here's the outcome we want to get to, and then enable it to happen by supporting people to get to that, but not to both say, here's the outcome we want to get to, and here's exactly how you will do it, because that's not enabling your people. That's just telling them what to do. You're losing out on all the innovation and ideas and knowledge and experience that your team has. And if you've hired great people, you want that. You want to take advantage of that. So the ability to operationalize is not, I know exactly what to do and I can tell everyone exactly how to do it. It's, I can define the end state. This is what we want to get to. And then I can help make that happen by greasing wheels, by creating the right boundaries and helping people move in that direction. That's true. Exactly. That's exactly right. Your job at the end of the day, particularly as your company grows, it's not to do almost anything. It's to hire great people and make them do good work. The way that you are successful as a founder is how you help other people be successful. Because as the company grows, there are going to be a lot more of them and proportionally a lot less of you. And so if you think that you doing things is the way to move forward, you're inevitably going to be wrong. And you as a founder need to help others be successful in order for your company to be successful. I think it was Steve Jobs, and he's the most oft quoted of people by founders, but he said, basically, all I do is hire great people. That's the only thing that makes Apple more successful than other companies. He obviously had incredible vision and strategy, but that was powered by him bringing on exceptional people and then enabling them to do great work, not because he was designing transistors himself. Right. It's really hard to have all of those traits. It's totally different skill sets. You're absolutely right. And that's also why I think when founders reach that point of being replaced, it is absolutely not a failure. It's just a reflection of the company's reached a point where your skill set is no longer the most useful one for the company's future success. That's okay. It's just saying you're not perfect at everything. And no one is. And we had a lot more to cover, but we just dived so deep on all these topics. We're over an hour now. So I'm cut it off here. First of all, Chrissy, this is awesome. Thank you for bringing your expertise. Would love to have you on again. No pressure now that it's out in the ether. Have you on again at some point to discuss other topics related to running companies. I feel like this flowed very well and the time passed quickly, but thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. I agree. We are indeed. That's right. Well, thank you all for listening and hope you join us next time.